On September 13, 1982, the road above Monaco twisted like a ribbon carved into stone. It was a familiar drive, narrow, sunlit, suspended between mountain and sea. Inside a Rover P6, Princess Grace of Monaco was returning from the countryside with her daughter. No cameras, no ceremony. Just a routine descent toward the principality that had become her adopted home. Minutes later, the car veered off the curve at La Turbie. Metal struck rock. The fairy tale fractured against limestone. News did not travel as gossip. It arrived as disbelief. The former Hollywood star who had left cinema for a crown was now in critical condition after a crash in one of Europe's most picturesque enclaves. Monaco, a place associated with yachts, galas, and choreographed elegance, became a site of sirens and urgency. By the next day, the palace confirmed what the world feared. Princess Grace had died from injuries sustained in the accident. The imagery was almost too stark to process. A real-life princess in a real-life palace, undone not by scandal or intrigue, but by a bend in the road. The contrast was brutal. How does a story that began with flashbulbs and cathedral bells end on an unguarded mountain curve? Speculation began immediately. Reports mentioned a possible stroke. Questions surfaced about who was driving at the exact moment of impact. Details were sparse, and in their absence, imagination rushed in. Yet beyond rumor was something more unsettling, the collapse of a narrative the world had accepted without question. Grace Kelly had been the American who married into royalty, the embodiment of poised reinvention. Her life seemed scripted, structured, serene. But mountains do not respect scripts, roads do not honor myth. On that September afternoon, the distance between fantasy and physics narrowed to a single misjudged turn. To understand how a Hollywood legend became a royal symbol, and how that symbol met such an ordinary force, we must go back to before Monaco, before the crown, before she was called princess at all. Long before Monaco, before cathedral bells and diplomatic receptions, she was Grace Patricia Kelly of Philadelphia. Born in 1929 into a prominent Irish-American family, Grace grew up in a household that valued discipline and achievement above display. Her father, John B. Kelly Sr., was an Olympic gold medalist turned successful businessman. Her mother had been a model and athlete. Success was not romanticized in the Kelly household, it was expected. Yet Grace, often described as reserved and observant, did not fit the image of the loud achiever. She was composed, measured, and intensely private. Beneath the quiet exterior, however, was a will that rarely bent once formed. At school, she gravitated toward performance not for attention, but for transformation. Acting offered something subtle yet powerful: control. On stage, emotions were structured, dialogue rehearsed, lighting predictable. Unlike social spaces, performance had boundaries. After studying at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, she began working in television and modeling to support herself. Early reviews noted her unusual presence, not flamboyant, but magnetic. Directors observed her stillness. She did not fill space with movement, she held it with restraint. In an industry that often rewarded overt drama, Grace's cool precision became her signature. Hollywood in the early 1950s was a system built on image management. Studios crafted personas as carefully as costumes. Grace entered that world already understanding presentation. She dressed impeccably, spoke carefully, and avoided public missteps. Her breakthrough roles showcased a duality, apparent fragility paired with underlying steel. In films like High Noon and later in collaborations with Alfred Hitchcock, she embodied elegance laced with tension. The camera loved her symmetry. Audiences sensed something guarded behind it. She was not simply beautiful, she was controlled. And control, in Hollywood, is power. By the mid-1950s, Grace Kelly had secured something rare: critical respect and box office appeal. An Academy Award for The Country Girl confirmed her legitimacy. She was at the height of her craft, ascending steadily in an industry that rewards momentum. No one watching her career unfold could have predicted that she would walk away from it. Yet even at her peak, Grace seemed aware that identity could be redefined. She had learned early that composure was armor, and armor can be removed, or exchanged, when the circumstances demand it. By the mid-1950s, Princess Grace of Monaco, then still Grace Kelly, had become something rare in Hollywood, a woman both luminous and untouchable. She wasn't marketed as scandalous or rebellious. She was precision, poise, Composure under pressure. Directors quickly realized her strength was not in melodrama but in restraint. When she appeared on screen, silence felt intentional. Every pause suggested intelligence behind the surface. She didn't beg for the camera leaned toward her. Her collaborations with Alfred Hitchcock defined this aura. In Dial M for Murder, Rear Window, and To Catch a Thief, Grace embodied elegance threaded with quiet tension. Hitchcock famously described her as a snow-covered volcano. That contradiction became her brand. She could appear icy, yet suggest fire beneath. Audiences projected mystery onto her because she never overshared. In an era of studio gossip columns and manufactured romance headlines, Grace maintained distance. Even her beauty felt sculpted: clean lines, calm gaze, immaculate wardrobe. Fashion designers adored her. Magazines positioned her as the new standard of American refinement. Then came the country girl, a role that shattered assumptions. Stripped of glamour, wearing minimal makeup, she portrayed a weary wife opposite Bing Crosby. Critics expected style. She delivered substance. The Academy Award she won in 1955 wasn't simply recognition, it was validation that her control extended beyond image. She could remove the elegance and still command attention. For a moment it seemed there was nowhere her career could not go. Studios offered scripts relentlessly. Producers imagined decades of prestige roles ahead. She was only 26. Youth, credibility, box office appeal. The combination is rare, and Hollywood knew it. But something in Grace's trajectory suggested she was not content to remain within the studio system indefinitely. Interviews from the time reveal an unusual self-awareness. She spoke carefully about privacy, about wanting a life beyond the screen's glare. While Hollywood elevated her into a myth of cool sophistication, she remained cautious about surrendering autonomy. By 1955, Grace Kelly was not just a movie star, she was an institution of style. Photographs from premieres show flashbulbs erupting around her like fireworks. Yet in many images, her expression is controlled, almost reserved. Stardom requires projection, but it also demands compromise. And while she mastered projection flawlessly, compromise was something she evaluated on her own terms. At the peak of cinematic dominance, when the industry assumed her ascent would continue uninterrupted, Grace Kelly was already standing at the threshold of an entirely different script, one no director in Hollywood had written. In 1955, during the Cannes Film Festival, Grace Kelly met Prince Rainier III. The meeting was arranged as a polite publicity event, a Hollywood star visiting a European royal. It was not scripted as destiny. Yet, within months, what began as diplomatic courtesy evolved into a courtship that captivated global headlines. For Monaco, a small principality seeking stability and international prestige, the possibility of marrying a major American actress was transformative. For Grace, it represented something else entirely, a redefinition of self. When their engagement was announced in early 1956, the reaction bordered on disbelief. Hollywood's rising Oscar-winning star was leaving at the height of her career to marry into royalty. Studios scrambled. Contracts dissolved. Scripts were reassigned. To the public, the story felt mythic, Cinderella transposed into Technicolor reality. The wedding in April 1956 was broadcast to millions worldwide, watched as though it were a film premiere with cathedral bells instead of studio fanfare. Her gown, designed by Helen Rose, became iconic overnight. Photographs from the ceremony cemented her transformation. Not Grace Kelly the actress, but Princess Grace of Monaco. But fairy tales often obscure logistics. Royal life was not a continuation of glamour, it was a departure from it. Grace relinquished her American citizenship and her film career. The woman who had commanded scripts now operated within protocol. Her days filled with ceremonial duties, charity work, and the careful maintenance of a principality's image. Monaco required more than elegance, it required discipline and diplomacy. Grace adapted with composure, but the transition was not frictionless. Friends later suggested she occasionally missed the creative autonomy of acting. In private, she sketched ideas for returning to the stage, though such plans were quietly discouraged by palace advisors concerned about royal decorum. The public narrative insisted she had won, traded studio lights for a throne. Yet sacrifice rarely announces itself loudly. It reveals itself in smaller ways, in opportunities declined, in identities reshaped. Princess Grace became a patron of the arts and a cultural ambassador for Monaco, helping elevate the principality's global profile. She navigated international appearances with the same precision she once brought to film sets. But control in Hollywood meant shaping scenes. Control in monarchy meant embodying expectation. By the early 1960s, Grace had successfully rebranded herself from actress to sovereign consort. The world admired the composure. The palace projected stability. The fairy tale appeared complete. And yet, unlike a film, there were no retakes. The script she had chosen was permanent: a crown instead of a camera, ceremony instead of spotlight. Few could have imagined that the narrative would not end in old age at a balcony, but on a mountain road decades later.
On the morning of September 13, 1982, Princess Grace left Rock Aigle, the family's country residence in the hills above Monaco, planning to return to the palace before the start of the school term. It was not a ceremonial journey. No motorcade, no escort, just a quiet descent along the winding road toward Monte Carlo. With her in the car was her youngest daughter, Princess Stephanie. The route was familiar, a narrow mountain pass known for sharp bends and dramatic drops. Locals had driven it for decades. It did not look like a place where history would pivot. Sometime during the descent near La Turbie, the vehicle failed to complete a curve. The Rover P6 broke through a retaining wall and tumbled down a steep embankment. Emergency responders arrived quickly. Princess Stephanie survived with injuries. Princess Grace was transported to the hospital in critical condition. Initial reports suggested she may have suffered a stroke behind the wheel, potentially causing loss of control before impact. Later investigations stated there was no definitive evidence of mechanical failure. The official cause of death was complications from severe injuries sustained in the crash, but official explanations rarely silence public curiosity. Questions surfaced immediately. Some speculated about the precise sequence of events. Was Princess Grace driving at the moment of impact? Did she lose consciousness before the curve? Could medical intervention have altered the outcome? Monaco's government maintained a composed public stance, emphasizing the tragic nature of the accident without inviting sensationalism. Still, the collision between myth and mortality was difficult for observers to reconcile. A princess whose life had seemed orchestrated with elegance had died in a moment stripped of ceremony. The global response was swift. Leaders sent condolences. Newspapers worldwide featured front-page tributes. In Monaco, crowds gathered in quiet grief. The image that lingered was not of the crash site, but of her wedding, her film premieres, her measured smile on palace balconies. The final drive did not erase the fairy tale. It complicated it. It forced the world to confront the fragility beneath the title. Royalty offers symbolism, not immunity. On that mountain curve, physics prevailed over narrative. And in the space between speculation and official record, Princess Grace became something else entirely. No longer just a star who married a prince, but a figure suspended between glamour and unanswered questions. After 1982, Princess Grace did not fade into archival memory. She transformed into a symbol, not merely of royalty, but of reinvention. Princess Grace of Monaco became the template for a modern fairy tale. The actress who walked away from fame, the American who embraced monarchy, the woman who balanced composure with quiet strength. Fashion houses continued referencing her clean lines and structured silhouettes. The Kelly bag by Hermès, named in her honor, became shorthand for refined luxury. Decades later, photographs of her remain fixtures in galleries, magazines, and royal retrospectives. Her influence extended beyond style. Later generations of royal women, from public-facing philanthropists to global fashion figures, were measured against the precedent she set. Poised in public, controlled in speech, charitable in focus, Grace helped elevate Monaco from a picturesque enclave into a cultural brand recognized worldwide. Through arts foundations and international appearances, she reshaped how a small principality could project influence without spectacle. Yet what lingers most is the paradox. She left Hollywood at its height to embrace permanence, a crown instead of a contract. The world often frames her story as sacrifice or triumph. Perhaps it was both. In cinema, she mastered stillness. In monarchy, she mastered duty. In memory, she exists between those worlds. neither entirely star nor solely sovereign. The mountain curve ended her life, but it did not end her narrative. Princess Grace remains suspended in collective imagination, eternally elegant, eternally composed, a fairy tale figure whose final chapter only deepened the myth.